Hey everyone, we're going to do a mini deep dive into some of the most common beading techniques. So the first thing I want to go over before we talk about what those techniques are the most common tools that you're going to need, and these are pretty good for most of the beading techniques that you're going to be doing. You can get more specific and vary the shapes and sizes once you know more what you like to do and what you need, but these are going to be your basic tools. The first thing is a pair of chain nose pliers. So these are flat on the inside and pointy at the tip so that you can bend and get into really close to the beads and things like that. The second pair is going to be a pair of round nose pliers. So these are tapered and round on both sides. And so these are something that you can change the size of as well, depending on what you choose to do in the future. The next item you're going to need is a pair of snips. These are just flush cutters. You're going to need these to snip any wire that you use or cord or things like that. And then the last item is going to be a pair of crimp pliers. These are not necessary. You can do most of the things with crimp pliers with your flat nose chain nose pliers, but these are really nice to have if you are using a lot of crimps. All right, so now that we've got the tools decided, the first order of business that we're going to cover is how to use headpins and ball pins, and the technique primarily that you're using with those is a wrap technique. So I have an example of two little items that I made that went on a pair of earrings that use that technique. These were with a ball pin and have a little wrap at the top so you can slide them on something. An example of how I used those was these hoop earrings. So all of these dangles have that same technique. So I'm going to teach you how to do that technique, and then from there, run with it and apply it to whatever format of jewelry you want and however you want to do it. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to be using is SBP 52, which is a 2-inch long 24 gauge sterling silver ball pin. And so it's got a little ball at the end as opposed to a head pin, which would be flat there, or an eye pin, which would have a little loop there. So I'm going to start with that, and I've already got my beads in this little tray all set up. I like to pre-count them out just so it's easier for me when I get to the beading part of it. And I'm going to be using GF1020, which are 2mm round gold fill beads, and STAR3, which is a 3mm sterling silver sparkle bead. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide my beads on in the pattern that I want. And so this part's totally up to you. Get creative, do whatever you want, use whatever beads excite you and float your fancy and are fun. This is where you get to get creative and show your personality and your design aesthetic. All right, so I've got my beads strung up on this head pin, ball pin, and you can see that I've got a length that's extra. Whenever you choose the length of your pin, you want to make sure that it's going to be long enough to accommodate your design. I always like to leave a little bit more than you think extra, just because it does make it a little bit easier to wrap that wire back around itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pair of chain nose pliers, and right at the tip there, I'm going to pinch right above my bead. And now where you pinch above the bead depends on how much wire you want to visibly wrap around your pin. So for example, on this little gold guy, I've got about 2 wraps, so I pinched a little bit higher. on the pins that I used for these earrings, I've only got about 1 wrap. So I made sure to get in really tight to that bead so that there wouldn't really be much pin visible. So you're going to pinch right at the top of that pin there, and then you're just going to fold it over 90 degrees. So you want it to look just like that. So I've got it folded over 90 degrees, and now I'm going to come in and take my round nose pliers, and I'm going to pinch right at the tip because that's the smallest place, and then I'm going to fold that wire around till it's parallel to where it was. So I've got it about halfway folded. And then I just like to reposition my pliers to the top, and that makes it easier to wrap that all the way around. And then so I've wrapped that all the way around until it crosses that wire. And now what I'm going to do is take my flat nose pliers and I'm going to pinch it right on that loop. And just with my finger, I'm just going to wrap that extra little tail around the body of the pin until I've got no more room. It's pushed up right against that top bead. And I'm going to come in with my snips. And I'm going to be really careful here because you want to make sure that you don't accidentally snip the body of the pin that you're using. And you're just going to snip off any excess tail, and you want to get in as close as you can there. So I've snipped that off, and now I'm just going to take my flat nose pliers and I'm just going to bend that little, pinch that little tip of the tail in just so that it's not sharp and not sticking out. And here, if you want, you can come in with your round nose and just tweak that loop that you've made. And now you've got an element for whatever piece of jewelry you want to make. And so the nice thing about this technique is it's pretty universal. You can use this with pre-made ball pins and head pins that have a link on one end, or you can just use stock wire and create a link where you have a loop on both ends. So if you did that, you'd loop up one end, slide all your beads on, and then do the same thing on the other. So this technique is going to be great for a lot of options, for stationary dangles, links in the middle of chain, necklaces, and things like that. Okay, so now we're going to move into the second technique, which is using crimps and typically some sort of cord or stainless steel flexible wire. So 2 examples of how I've used that is the center section of this necklace is strung up on a piece of cord with 2 crimps at the end. And then I've also used that same technique for this pair of earrings where I've just looped it around onto the same jump ring to create that nice oval pear shape. And the flexible cord is really nice and conducive for shapes like that, for making circles and things like that. So what you're going to need for this technique is all the same tools that you did for the head pin, plus a pair of crimp pliers, which just make crimping a little bit easier. And then we are also going to use some of this cord, which is JFT 1930. It's the medium, which describes how flexible it is. And these cords come in different sizes and different flexibilities, and that's something that will be project specific. But the medium is a nice kind of all-around good basic one. So the first thing that you're going to do is make sure to cut a piece that is a little extra longer than you need because it does need to come in and fold back in on itself in a couple places. So the piece I'm going to be making right now is just a little insert that I'll likely use for the top of a bracelet, and I'll connect it to 2 chain pieces, kind of just like this necklace, but for a bracelet. So I'm just gonna cut a piece of cord wire that I know is long enough, and I'm going to use my snips for that. Depending on what you're doing, and if you would like to, you can absolutely use a ruler during this stage and be a little more specific with how much you're cutting off. So the first thing I'm going to do is slide a 2mm crimp bead on, which is SCT1, and they're just these little tubes that go on the end of our wire. So I'm going to slide the tube on, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that end of the wire and I'm going to wrap it back around and feed it back through that crimp bead. And then I want to make sure that my wires don't cross within the bead. We want them nice and parallel. And I'm going to pull that crimp bead up towards the end of my wire so that I've got a nice tiny loop there. Sometimes you'll want bigger loops, but generally you want them to be kind of as invisible as possible. So you just want to make sure that that loop is big enough to fit over whatever you're linking it to, whether that's a jump ring or directly to a clasp or chain or whatnot. So I've got my crimp on. My wires going through the crimp are parallel, they're not crossing. And now I'm going to take my crimp pliers and I'm going to use the back section. You can see here that there's 2 sections, a front one and a back one. And the back one kind of has this little extra divot in it, and that's the one I'm going to use. So I'm going to come right over my crimp in the back and give it a good squeeze. And what that's done is it's put a line right down the middle, right where my wires go. And then with the front section of these crimp pliers, I'm just going to take that crimp and I'm going to fold it in half. So just put it in there and give it a little squeeze. And that rounds it out, makes it a little bit smaller and a little bit neater. And so now once you've got that crimped on, with that squeezing process, it squeezes those wires into place so that they're not going to move. I'm going to come in now with my snips and I'm just going to snip off this little extra tail because we don't need it. And it's right then and there that you want to be careful not to snip the rest of your wire at the same time. So I'm going to come in now and slide my beads on in the pattern that I've chosen. I'm going to be using GFR2, rose gold fill 2mm round bead, and S1030L, which is just a 3mm round silver bead. So I'm going to go ahead and slide all my beads on. Okay, so I've got my beads slid on there, and the next thing I'm going to do is slide another crimp bead on. So I'm going to slide my little tube on, and just as we did on the first side, it's the same process on the second side. I'm going to take the tail of my cord and I'm going to thread it back through that crimp. Now this is the part where it's just a little bit more finicky because you want to make sure that your crimp is nice and tight up towards your beads so that you don't have any extra wire showing. And you still want to make sure that within your crimp those wires are parallel if you can. And you want to make sure that that's a small loop. You're trying to basically match them on either side. So I've got that all set up. And I'm going to use the back section of my crimp pliers, give that crimp a good squeeze. And now I'm going to take the front section and crimp it so that I fold that crimp in half. All right, now that's nice and tight. It's not gonna go anywhere. And then the last thing I'm going to do is cut off this extra tail with my snips. Okay, and that's that part where you really want to be careful that you don't snip the body of your cord. So now we've got this guy all done, and it looks pretty good, right? Like it's nice, but it's totally usable right now. But just to clean it up a little bit extra, we can use these things called crimp covers, which are kind of like a half moon shaped hollow kind of bead. And what they do is they come right over the crimp, they hide that crimp and look like a bead. So it really helps blend that process in. So you just take your crimp cover, which we're using SB093, and those fit the 2mm crimps that we're using. So I just put it over, and I'm just gonna close it just gently with my fingers, just a little bit so that it doesn't fall off. And then I'm going to use the front section of my crimp pliers and just gently give that bead a squeeze until those two ends come together. You don't want to cramp down on this too hard because you don't need to pinch anything. The crimp bead cover is not holding anything in place. It's not structural. It's purely decorative to make it look a little bit cleaner. And so now you can see that that crimp bead on the end kind of just looks like the decorative beads that I have in the middle. And so it's a really nice visual addition to this little piece. So I'm going to come in on the other side with my crimp bead cover, give it a little squeeze with my fingers, and I'm going to come in with my crimp pliers on the front section and just give that a little bit of a squeeze so that that little crimp cover is all closed up and looks exactly like a bead. And now I've got a jewelry element that I can use for whatever I want. Like this necklace is a great option. You can make full necklaces or bracelets with this technique. Like I said, these are the most basic kind of universal beading techniques that you're going to use. And so now that you know how to do the crimping and the wrapping, it's up to you of how to use them, where you want to use them, how long you want them, how short you want them, earrings, necklaces, bracelets. It's really totally up to you, and let your inspiration run wild. So thanks for joining me for this crash course in the most popular beading techniques.